Hello, my name is Lena Connor, and I'm pleased to welcome to you to tonight's event entitled Fossil Funding, Should We Divest from Fossil Fuels? This event is co-sponsored by 4 organizations: the Pomona Student Union, the Associated Students of Pomona College, and the Claremont College's Sustainability Coalition, and last but certainly not least, Sustainable Claremont. The Associated Students of Pomona College exists to provide for reasonable and effective student participation in the governance of the college, to be a representative voice of the students both on and off campus, and to provide programs and services to assist in the completion of the educational mission of the college. The Claremont College's Sustainability Coalition is a 5-college organization that seeks to unite the colleges in a sustainable vision for our consortium and to act as a liaison between the colleges in statewide and nationwide environmental campaigns. Sustainable Claremont engages people in education and action to create a more sustainable community, environmentally, socially, and economically, in the city of Claremont and beyond. And finally, the Pomona Student Union is a nonpartisan, student-run organization that works to increase campus dialogue on significant issues. We do so by bringing speakers together in order to represent multiple angles on various current events and debates. We do not intend to promote any single perspective, but instead to encourage the campus community to challenge assumptions and consider all points of view. All of the organizations represented here hope that the conversation about divestment does not stop after tonight, but instead that you consider what was said in this event and continue to dialogue with friends, peers, and professors. Tonight we're discussing the proposition of removing investments in fossil fuel companies in light of their contribution to climate change and environmental degradation. Bill McKibben, the famed environmental activist who founded the international climate movement 350.org, unveiled the fossil fuels divestment campaign this winter in his nationwide Do the Math tour, in which he calculated that, in his opinion, financially supporting any fossil fuel endeavor, given the scale of the resulting climate effect, is foolhardy. 350.org and a coalition of environmental organizations are facilitating this divestment movement, calling for institutions, specifically colleges like ours, and individuals to pull their investments from the world's 200 large coal, oil, and gas companies. Here to discuss the pros and cons of divestment in our community is tonight's talented panel. They're not in the order that I intended them to be, but I forgot to tell them to be. So first we have Jess Grady Benson, a Pitzer student, a 350 intern, and a co-leader of the Claremont College's divestment team, which has been featured in the New York Times, the Huffington Post, the Nation, and the Rolling Stone magazine. And I bet you can tell which one she is. Then we have next to her John Jurowitz, lecturer in economics at Pomona, who teaches natural resource economics and energy economics and has much experience in the professional energy sector. Char Miller is our moderator at the end, who's W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis at Pomona, the director of the EA program, and who teaches environmental history and will be our moderator for the evening. Heather Williams, chair of the Pomona Politics Department, teaches several environmental politics classes, including global politics of food, agriculture, and water. William Asher Donald, Senior McKenna Professor of Government Economics at Claremont McKenna, teaches environmental policy and sustainable economic development. And finally, Paul Steinberg, Associate Professor of Political Science and Environmental Policy at Harvey Mudd, teaches comparative environmental policy and the role of social movements in environmental decision-making. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers. Before we begin, I must ask everyone to silence their cell phones. The format of the event will be a panel discussion with 4 segments. Panelists will open with 4-minute intros, and then we'll move on to a 20-minute segment of moderated questions from Char, then a 20-minute segment of back-and-forth conversation and debate, and then finally a 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how many questions you have, Q&A, moderated Q&A with the audience. So let the event begin.
First of all, I'm so excited to see so many people here, both familiar and unfamiliar faces, and I hope we'll get to have a really great educational and stimulating conversation tonight about divestment. We are all here tonight because we need to mitigate the climate crisis for the sake of human rights and a livable planet. Groups and organizations have been working for decades on multiple strategies to avoid climate catastrophe, yet only political victory we've seen is the 2009 Copenhagen Accord global agreement to limit global temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. The Carbon Tracker Initiative reports that the fossil fuel industry has access to 5 times the amount of coal, oil, and natural gas that would push us past this 2-degree target. This means that the fossil fuel industry must keep 80% of their reserves underground. We found that we can't gain enough social or political change within the current paradigm that allows the fossil fuel industry to shape not only our laws, but every aspect of the way that we live. Through the acquisition and holding of fossil fuel investments, the Claremont colleges are implicitly supporting this industry. As institutions known for taking action to confront issues of social responsibility and sustainability, it is inconsistent and hypocritical for the Claremont colleges to remain invested in fossil fuels. For example, Pitzer College holds environmental sustainability as one of its core values as expressed by its mission statement. It has been said that sustainability is part of our DNA. Divestment is not simply a symbolic action, but an opportunity to actualize these core values and stand out as leaders in environmental and social responsibility. Our request for divestment includes the immediate freeze of new investments in the fossil fuel industry and the complete phase out or divestment of all existing fossil fuel investments within 5 years. To clarify, we are focusing on the 200 top oil, gas, and coal companies with the largest fossil fuel reserves. The Claremont College's divestment team is comprised of over 60 active members from all 5 colleges, with support from a number of faculty and alumni. Our petition currently has over 850 signatures of support from the 5Cs alone. Just yesterday, we passed a resolution through the Pitzer Student Senate in favor of divestment with only 1 vote against us. Our campaign alone has drawn extensive media coverage by The Nation, The New York Times, Rolling Stone, and KPCC Radio. The campaign for fossil fuel divestment extends well beyond the boundaries of our campuses, encompassing over 252 other colleges and universities. Cities such as Seattle and San Francisco, as well as some religious institutions, are considering divestment. This movement has the potential to initiate change on a large scale. This campaign is about divestment, but it's about more than that. It's about building a movement to solve the climate crisis. We live in a society in which true carbon neutrality is virtually impossible because of the political and economic stronghold of the fossil fuel industry. The environmental and social costs incurred by this industry are being externalized. These companies have enough lobbying power to protect their subsidies and avoid strict regulation. We must strip the fossil fuel industry of their social license to profit from an unsustainable future. This will pave the way for political and social paradigm shifts that will allow us to make changes we need to mitigate the climate crisis. Divestment is by no means an ultimate solution. It is the essential first step.
Okay, well, I don't make a habit of stepping in front of fast-moving trains, but I think we need to slow down just a little bit and proceed deliberately and make the most of this opportunity and make sure that it doesn't politically backfire on us. Bill McKibben himself has said that this is a political strategy born of frustration, and I sympathize. Personally, I'm not too enthusiastic, however, about joining in a largely symbolic, quixotic campaign born of frustration that may, in fact, and I think it will be rather ineffective and perhaps even counterproductive. At a minimum, I think this effort needs to be politically repackaged by the 5Cs and supplemented with far more substantive and effective initiatives. So I stand here tonight as your unsolicited, self-appointed political advisor. Make no mistake, this is not going to have any real direct impact on these companies. We can't hurt these companies as investors. They don't need you as investors. I'll elaborate later during discussion. They need you as consumers. They need you as consumers and placated, non-active voters. You need to be active voters and active consumers. This campaign is largely political and symbolic, but we don't want to make it easy for our political enemies to pull some jujitsu move and use the symbol to their own advantage, which I think they all too easily can do. It's all too easy for our enemies basically to caricature you as a bunch of rich elitist students marching around protesting, because that's what students do, right? I've already heard that from Sean Hannity and others, all right? Everyone knows you drive cars, everyone knows you fly in airplanes, and you have no political credibility without real sacrifice, visible sacrifice. And this initiative, considered only in its isolation as divestment, involves no great sacrifice. Instead, it can all too easily be cast as hypocritical, elite, limousine liberalism, self-righteousness. Now, you're never going to get Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity on your side. I understand that, but don't serve them up softballs. This has to be just one feature of a much more aggressive plan. This isn't the cornerstone of anything. This is the flag on the flagpole at the top of the building. This is flying your colors. It's not the beef. So where's the beef? Well, your political consultant is here to give you the beef. So I have a 5-point plan. I'm going to call this the Claremont 5C plan. It's based on 2 underlying objectives. First, reduce carbon emissions. Second, jumpstart Plan B. What's Plan B? It's renewables. If you're not doing one of those 2 things, you ain't doing anything. First, very aggressively pursue all energy efficiency and renewable technologies on campus. And I know the campuses are all moving in that direction, but you've got to do it aggressively. And at the end of the day, you're still going to be consuming electricity from Edison. I want you to go out and buy renewable energy credits and convert all that electricity into renewable electricity so we can say we're 100% renewable with our purchases from Edison. Now, second, we need to become net zero carbon campuses. And this must include automobile use and airline flights as well. You've got absolutely no political credibility without covering those things. Now, fortunately, you've got an avenue now to do it in California. On January 1st, the California Air Resources Board kicked off a cap and trade program. It involves an annual issuance of permission slips. You can go out and buy those permission slips. We can have a big party on Walker Beach. We can tear them up on Earth Day, and they'll no longer be in other people's hands. I've got 3 more things, and I'll raise them in discussion.
Heather, be as excited.
First of all, let me say that it's a huge honor to be here, and I'm really energized, and I'm just really energized by your commitment to doing something about climate change. As I understand the position on divestment of the movement, and I'm taking this off the website of one of the participating colleges, saying it is contradictory and self-defeating that the college invests its endowment in companies that threaten the future of its students, community, and life on Earth as we know it. The moral case for divesting from fossil fuel companies, as I see it, is that these are mammoth companies who have extracted their profits at the expense of human communities around the world, showing reckless disregard for human life, health, species, and the environment. Unfortunately, Shell, BP, Exxon, and Chevron are bywords for some of the most devastating environmental spills and contamination on Earth. On climate change, their actions have been reprehensible. While they've continued to pursue extractions in increasingly risky areas, they've been funding AstroTurf, i.e. fake grassroots organizations that appear to create the sense that there's a groundswell for business as usual when there isn't. They back climate change skeptics and utilize media apparatuses to skew press coverage of the issue to make it appear that there is controversy on the numbers and the models when there really isn't. They are enjoying ample public subsidies for extraction, refining, distribution, and trade while flouting regulatory standards and often paying little or nothing in corporate income tax. So I'm not a fan. Divestment also there's a strong moral case for it. It's a form of financial boycott, and it's as a nonviolent tactic, it has an esteemed history in struggles for justice. Many of you know about the Great Boycott of United Farm Workers, the lettuce boycott. Maybe you're old enough to have remembered the Taco Bell boycott of the Immokalee workers in Florida, the South African divestment campaign. Before I was born, the Montgomery bus boycott. In the last century, the boycotts of Congolese rubber in the 19th century to fight the slave trade. In fact, the word boycott comes from the Lord Boycott, who was a nasty English landowner whose businesses were shunned on behalf of the Irish who were displaced by him. There were boycotts of the Jacobins and Parisian laborers of coffee from Saint-Domingue in support of ending slavery in Haiti. So that being said, I'd love to follow that by saying, go for it, fight. Divestment is the single most important thing you can do in the face of climate change. Unfortunately, that's not quite my message. Morally, I think you're right. Tactically speaking, consider that this campaign singularly pursued may be folly, and I think I agree with you, John, on many of the things you say. But as a political scientist, I'm going to focus more on politics. And here's why I think what I do. A lot of people say, I don't think this will make much of a difference, but I want to make a statement. I say don't spend inordinate time and resources on statements when you actually could make a difference. My advice, I have 2 points. If you pursue divestment, and I think that people have decided this is a good thing to do. The first thing, 2 words. A very wise labor organizer once said to me many years ago, 2 words, fight last. People often make the mistake of wanting to show their commitment by taking the most personal risks possible, occupying buildings, doing hunger strikes, etc. But understand that the media will frame that more as an action than a conversation. And so don't marginalize yourself before you have to. And second of all, consider using your time and energy to direct pressure on the one entity that has the power to make an enormous long-term impact in the output of greenhouse gases, the US federal government. If no levy is put on the output portion of greenhouse gases, effectively sending a price signal on all goods and services, either in the form of a good cap and trade bill or a carbon tax, nothing else really matters. So I think you have power, and small groups often have inordinate power to influence the government through the boring actions of petitions and speeches and policing votes in Congress. So think about doing that as a supplement to what you're doing. Thank you.
Would the people in the back like to move to the front, get some seats? It's just going to go on for 4 or 5 hours. There are plenty of seats here. This should not count against my time, okay? I think I'll also take a consequentialist position here and acknowledge that there are symbolic reasons, there are Kantian reasons to take a position, but I'm going to focus 2 observations on the consequences of divestment, and then I'm going to make some suggestions. Not all that different from what you just heard, in fact. The first observation is that the long-term impact on hydrocarbon companies would be very close to 0. Their stock value is determined basically by price-earnings ratios and other things of that sort, whether they hit good veins. It's not going to make a difference if the colleges or even a whole bunch of different institutions divest. That's not really what the game is. Second, some of the students asked, would this be a hit on Pomona's endowment if Pomona and other universities and colleges divest? And the answer is only slightly, but not for the reason you might think. It's not because oil stocks are actually more profitable. If you take into account the volatility and risk, most things are about the same in terms of risk-averse earnings. It's because if you have to sell something at a particular time dictated by factors other than your own timing, you're going to lose a little bit. But that's not really an important factor. Now, in terms of recommendations, I think that targeting all hydrocarbon producers is way too broad. This is an opportunity to focus on the most environmentally problematic ones and the most problematic types of hydrocarbon exploitation, like tar sands, both in Canada and in Venezuela. Those are things that cause a lot more pollution, and it seems to me that you want to have a more pinpointed focus. You can, of course, push divestment for promotional purposes rather than directly economic impacts. But again, you'd have more impact if you focus more narrowly on the firms that are doing the most damage. I also think it's odd to focus on supply rather than demand. Professor Jurowitz mentioned this. There are lots of things that could be done on the demand side. For example, some cities have gone through municipalization of their electric utilities because they find that their private utilities are not using as much renewable resources as they could. So they take over the electric company with a mandate to do more in terms of renewables. You can also eliminate subsidies. This has been the bane of a lot of the environmental problems, and it's bad economics. There's a real win-win if you eliminate subsidies. Then the economy becomes more efficient, and in addition to that, the environment gets to be better. Finally, I'd like to raise a question. What are your comparative advantages? And remember, in economics, a comparative advantage is not how well you do compared to other people. A comparative advantage is what you do compared to other things you can do. You're very energetic. There are various efforts you can undertake. The question you have to ask is, are you getting the greatest bang for your time by focusing on divestment?
Thank you again to the organizers for putting this together. It seems to me that the fundamental question before us is whether young people can change their world for the better. Certainly, if I were in the position of the students who are leading this campaign, notwithstanding the minutiae of discussions of tactics, which I look forward to engaging in tonight, that would be the big question weighing over my mind. Can I actually make a difference? And so before digging into the details, as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about sort of how social change happens in different national contexts, I'd like to address that big question, that deeper question first. On that question, let there be no doubt that students can change the course of history. The historical record is very clear on this. Let's not forget that the first Earth Day, 1970, the thing that got the ball rolling with respect to legislation and changing the regulatory framework within which businesses operate in the United States and abroad, those were students. That was a campus movement. We give the credit to the Senator Gaylord Nelson who kicked the thing off, but those were students, okay? And so the millions of people who turned out are proof that young people can make a difference. And the political momentum generated from that, as I say, is what made it possible for policymakers to move on these things. As a matter of fact, in a comparative assessment of how different countries responded to student protests in the 1970s, it's noted in a book called Green States and Social Movements by Dryzek and colleagues, that for the Nixon administration, the environment appeared to be one problem that maybe they could do something about. That is to say, they were faced on all sides with demands with respect to civil rights, Vietnam, and so forth, and maybe the environment was something they could do something about. So students matter. This carpet under your feet has no formaldehyde. The reason is students, and the student contribution to the creation of the political momentum that allowed the banning of cancer-causing formaldehyde from carpets. The reason why these bulbs are not incandescent, the reason why there's no lead paint on the walls, this is because of students. The reason why we can see Mount Baldy today, it's in part, as I say, because of students. There would not be environmental studies professors up here were it not for student demand for environmental courses. That's how the cash flows within a university system. Your demand, every time you select a course, you are in effect voting. You are saying something about what you believe to be valuable and important, and that's where the resources flow, and that's how hires are made. So, on this question, let's be absolutely clear that you can make a difference. Most recently, with respect to LEED certified buildings, college campuses have been way out in front on LEED certified buildings, and that movement nationwide has transformed the world's largest industry, the building construction industry, which is larger than the oil industry. Between 2008 and 2010, the market for green buildings grew by 50% to over $55 billion. Cities and states and federal governments have followed suit, often requiring LEED certification. All new U.S. embassies everywhere in the world must now meet LEED certified standards. And again, that was in large part because of a push on college campuses as well as in other areas of the nonprofit sector. Now, college students, I've been teaching for a long time, and college students have a habit of asking, I've actually taught 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, not 11th, 12th, undergraduate, master's, and PhD level since the 1980s. And let me say, I've learned over this, the course of these events, that students have a habit of asking really annoying questions. What makes these questions so annoying is that they're simple questions. You'll also notice that the greatest intellectuals of our time, people like Jared Diamond, have a habit of asking simple questions. So why is there so much war in the world? Why is there so much poverty? Why do companies pollute? Why aren't more people speaking out on this issue? We older people like to say, you know, it's a lot more complicated. And it is a lot more complicated than that. And yet, there is something in the simple question that makes the simple question the most profound question of all. One such question was posed in Nashville, 1960, during the lunch counter sit-ins, which were led by college students. It wasn't just Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, it was college students at those lunch counters. And in Memphis, the students one day marched across town to City Hall, and in a very rare moment, the mayor, this was Nashville, not Memphis, this was in Nashville, similar dynamics occurring in Memphis at the time. The mayor of Nashville, a man by the name of Ben West, was asked a very annoying question by a student. A young student named Diane Nash asked the mayor, and it turns out the media was there with microphones that picked all of this up. She said, "Mr. Mayor, do you personally believe that restaurants should deny service to African Americans?" Completely putting this man on the spot with this annoying question. And in that moment of reckoning, faced with this very intense question, he said, "I believe everybody should be served at these restaurants." And it went nationwide in the media. The lunch counters were desegregated within 3 weeks. And the Civil Rights Act was passed 4 years later. Time. Okay, so in conclusion, students are now asking more annoyingly simple questions like, how does the college invest its money? And why are we supporting things that are not supporting our future? And so I look forward to getting into the minutiae of the debate, but I just want to be sure that we don't lose sight of these big and simple questions that have brought us here.
So in line with the simple questions that Paul has proposed we speak to, let me ask Jess, first of all, a response to the critiques in part, especially around tactics, and whether there is a response to John and Heather and Bill's concerns.
First of all, I think as environmental analysis majors, as I feel many of us in the audience are, we're constantly thinking about what's the best way to use my energy to make a difference. I'm prepared to spend the rest of my life trying to make a difference, and this opportunity came at a really, really critical time, I believe. As all of us have discussed, I think students have an incredible amount of unique power to create change politically and to drive political momentum towards larger change, even if it starts with very simple actions. This divestment movement is not only symbolic, as I mentioned before. We're working towards paradigm shift. We don't claim that divestment is the end-all be-all solution to the climate crisis. That would be ridiculous. But we do believe that it's a great opportunity to provide students with a chance to start a public discourse about the nature of the fossil fuel industry and the nature of our fossil fuel run political economy, basically. And the economic effect on the fossil fuel industry, we also do not claim through divestment to be gigantic. We don't think that withdrawing the $3 billion endowment of the collective 5 colleges is going to hurt the bottom line of the fossil fuel industry. That's completely ignorant. But we do believe that there is going to be a huge domino effect from that movement and from the united network that we've created with over 250 schools across the nation. This movement has been going on for 4 months, and there are schools adding to the list of divestment campaigns every single day. This movement has an incredible amount of momentum, and it can only lead towards bigger change. In terms of focusing on renewable energy projects on campus, divestment and renewable energy projects are not mutually exclusive. We don't have to stop one to do the other. They're happening all the time. Last year I participated in an internship to create a climate action plan for Pitzer College, and we did a greenhouse gas emissions reduction report and created all sorts of plans for how to proceed towards carbon neutrality. Guess what our date for projected carbon neutrality was? 2050. We don't have that kind of time to wait. Even if we push forward aggressively, we can't wait till 2050 to divest from fossil fuels. If we don't divest now, any actions we take in the meanwhile will be illegitimate. They'll be inconsistent with our mission. How can we fund the progress and momentum of our schools with an industry that is completely contradicting those values?
So John, my simple question for you is, you had 3 more points.
You're right, you're
Less
right.
than 2 minutes to do it.
Sorry, you're so kind to ask. Okay, so point number 3. Get all of the campuses within California to do the same thing relative to going out and buying these carbon permission slips from the California Air Resources Board and retiring them in order to zero net out all the carbon on campus. Number 4, and I don't have a lot of hope for this, but this is part of an overall political plan, and that is, at the federal level, we need to try to convince, or we need to certainly put out an initiative to rebalance the federal tax structure. What's that about? We tax good stuff. We tax labor. We tax investment. Screw that. Tax the bad stuff. Rebalance things, dollar for dollar. It's a free lunch. You don't get many free lunches. This is a free lunch. And finally, let me pick up on something that Bill said, and that is the conditionality of divestiture. I don't buy into just saying, here's a list of 200 bad guys in the world. They're existentially bad. People need to be flagged and pilloried for their behavior. I can't say that all 200 people on that list are bad just because they're supplying fossil fuels. We're all using fossil fuels. And this is a matter of political positioning, too. You need to get them to refuse to do something. You need to get them to refuse to endorse meaningful cap and trade or taxes on carbon. And when they refuse to do that, they're out of here. That's when you throw them away. And that's very, very important in terms of political positioning. So that's my 5-point plan, and I dare you to adopt it. And if you do, you can call my bluff, and I'll have to join you.
So Heather, does what John has said, at least the last 3, reach towards some of the questions that you raised about tactics?
I think it does, although I feel that, John, what you're identifying is a really important form of prefigurative politics, of bringing our actions in line with our stated values. I think that's incredibly important. But ultimately, the idea of people engaging in moral action that maybe isn't in their own interest is maybe it's necessary but not sufficient. I think we actually have to have a conversation about what set of federal policies we support. The U.S. Per capita is one of the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitters, and if you think about historical accumulation of emissions, we may be the highest except for some of the northern countries, like Iceland or something. But so I actually think that we have to have this really hard conversation about parsing which pieces of federal legislation are viable. We also have a second term of the Obama administration, and it's do or die right now. The EPA has gone to court. They have received a ruling that enables them to regulate CO2 as a pollutant. That's an incredibly important ruling, but it takes a lot of guts to actually act on that in the face of congressional inaction on this. I also think we have a new Democratic representative for this district, Judy Chu, who I think has her heart in the right place, but isn't receiving nearly enough support from people in the district. She has written and said she has joined the House Sustainable Energy Environmental Coalition in Congress, which is fighting the political attacks aimed at the EPA and working to safeguard the public protections found in the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. I think it's really important to thank her for that action and to use, for Democrats in the House, to use the bully pulpit of being a minority party to call out the vote buying and the political favoritism and the corporate welfare that's being extended to some of the worst polluters out there. So I think there's a role for that in addition to also walking the walk.
So let me real quickly ask a second question, Heather. If Congress has been so inactive, and it has been, if it's dominated in the House by the Republican Party, and if the Obama administration has, through its first term, not acted on these issues, what actually is going to get them to act? I mean, the Democrats as a minority party have no power whatsoever. They can't even go to meetings.
Everything, and I was actually talking with someone last night who was in the administration. They said everything was aimed at re-election.
Yeah.
And so now, none of these people have a job in 4 years. And so there's a really different set of incentives, and they're thinking about what is their historical legacy. So take advantage of the fact that all these people want to go down in history as having done the right thing where possible. And so I think they may have a certain kind of second-term courage here that's certainly worth testing. No harm done in making the Obama administration understand how important this is to you.
Bill, you talked about comparative advantages and argued that the greatest bang for the buck needs to be what?
I think it needs to be focusing on issues that are much more targeted to the major culprits. Point that Zordi
Like
made.
whom?
BP. You know, this time when BP declared itself the energy company, the CEO of BP said, we are now really going to pay a lot of attention to the environment, deliberately set some standards which were unachievable. All the people in BP knew they were unachievable and ignored them. So it's not that difficult to identify companies that have really been quite heinous in their operations. And then you can have an impact. Embarrassment makes a difference. If you're not trying to embarrass 200, then we're all in the same boat. If you're trying to embarrass 10, it makes a difference. You want to look for win-wins, including the win-win of getting rid of subsidies, as I mentioned before. And you also need to institutionalize the movement. There was a famous article written many years ago by Anthony Downs, a political scientist, called something like the Issue Attention Cycle